It's great to have a conversation called Spectrum of Sovereignty, because then nobody really totally understands what the conversation's about. So let me just set exactly what it is. John started that, but let me just say we have an international system that is based on sovereign states. The whole system has been set up that way for, we're coming up on 80, 90 years of that system, and we assume that the borders mean something, and what that means is you recognize that that state is in charge of that territory. We recognize your borders, we send diplomats, your diplomats come to our nation, and you say that that sovereign state also has certain responsibilities. They're accountable to international law, they're accountable to their citizens, they have the right to use force domestically, they have the right to protect their nation. And yet we have a world now in which sovereignty is under tremendous strain and stress. We have nations where the borders exist on a map, and yet inside territories are held by non-state actors. And we have states that are in the UN, and yet they are failed states from a governance perspective. We have transnational actors, transnational crime or terrorists. We have corporations and non-state actors that are playing positive roles, but really also stressing the sovereign state system. We have countries that are sovereign states, and yet they're using sovereignty to protect themselves from some of their bad behavior at home. So this whole idea of sovereignty really is under strain, and there is a spectrum of sovereignty where it's working in practice, and those places where we're saying like, oh, I guess it's still a good idea, but actually what we're seeing is not quite what was meant. So I am so thrilled to be delighted to be joined by three panelists who have tremendous expertise living and working on these issues day in, day out, and also bring a tremendous amount of regional expertise. So let me introduce them, and then we'll jump into our conversation. Dr. Chris Fomunyoh, friend and former colleague, is currently the Senior Associate for Director for Africa and Senior Associate for Africa and Regional Director for Central and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute, one of our leading democracy support organizations in the United States. He recently designed and helped launch the African Statesman Initiative, which is a program aimed to facilitate political transitions in Africa. To his left, hello Chris, and to his left is Ambassador Feisal al-Istrabadi. Ambassador al-Istrabadi is the founding director of the Center for the Study of Middle East at Indiana University in Bloomington. From 2004 to 2010, he represented Iraq at the United Nations, having previously acted as legal advisor to the Iraqi foreign minister during the negotiations for the UN Security Council Resolution 1546, recognizing Iraq's reassertion of its sovereignty. And he was intricately involved in the drafting of the Constitution for Iraq. To his left, the interim Constitution, thank you.
If I like the results better on the final one, I might have claimed it.
Right. As an interim president, I understand how that flexibility works. To his left is Keith Mines, who has joined the U.S. Institute of Peace, working on their Latin America portfolio after a distinguished career at the United States Department of State, where he served for 32 years of diplomatic and military service. His last post at the State Department was focused as the director of Andean and Venezuelan affairs. And he has worked in his long public career working on governance and institution building in Central America, Colombia, Middle East, and the Middle East peace process in Israel and the West Bank, post-conflict stabilization in Haiti, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So we have a wealth of knowledge on the panel. Let me just start, and we'll start with Chris and go down. What are the most pressing challenges that you see to sovereignty around the world today? And please feel free to include some examples from the region that you are expert on.
Thank you very much, Nicole, for those very kind words of introductions. And let me just say what a delight, what a pleasure it is to be with all of you this morning. I have had the privilege of speaking to a number of World Affairs Council chapters across the US, across the United States, and it's good to see some old friends amongst all of you. The issue of the spectrum of sovereignty is really a fascinating subject, especially for those of us working on the global south or on continents such as Africa, because while the principle was enshrined since you have to go back to the 17th, 18th century, for most of those countries, it's been a work in progress because it came into being at independence, given their history of having been colonized by other world powers. And with that frame of reference, I would say there are three major challenges that I see. The first one is that I believe the principle of sovereignty comes with it or conjures with it a national cohesion, a national consensus within the given nation state about the concept of sovereignty. Unfortunately, in many of the countries on the continent of Africa and in the global south, speaking broadly, that national consensus doesn't exist. In this case of Africa, for example, the Organization of African Unity, which was the continental body, in 1963, as African countries, former colonies began to achieve independence, actually adopted one of its principles that countries would respect the borders that were inherited at independence. And this was to kind of get that first pillar of sovereignty, which is a national territory over which the central government has control, in place. But what we've seen has been a constant challenge to that very fundamental principle across Africa. That explains why Eritrea, for example, had to come out of Ethiopia. That explains why South Sudan in the mid-90s had to come out of Sudan. And even today as we speak, there is a battle between Somaliland and Somalia over the whole question of sovereignty. And so if you don't master that first principle, it becomes extremely difficult to exert, for the country to exert its sovereignty. The second challenge that I would see, or that I see, is that coloration between sovereignty and legitimacy. And the fact that even in countries where the national borders are accepted and not in contestation, if the central government cannot benefit from a high degree of legitimacy, it's going to be extremely difficult for it to exercise sovereignty over its national territory. And this legitimacy can be challenged from within in terms of how the government got into power. In some cases, we're dealing with military juntas. It could also be derived from the way in which the government is able to deliver services, public services, to its citizens. And that brings to the fore the whole concept of ungovernable spaces, populations that live in border areas that feel an affiliation more with neighboring countries than with the central government of their own state, and states that have lost this legitimacy because of their inability to provide public services to their citizens. In those kinds of situations, the concept of sovereignty rings a little hollow. And the third challenge that I see is just the interference of other non-state actors. And I know we'll come to that. But that's a frequent occurrence in the Sahel, for those of you studying the Sahel. The Sahel, we see an influence of foreign fighters, extremist organizations, terrorist organizations that are taking advantage of the weakness of central governments, the porous borders and ungovernable spaces to be able to engage in all kinds of illicit and illegal activities which weaken the government's ability or the country's ability to exercise and exert its sovereignty. Thank you.
Excellent. That was excellent and gives us a great framework for our conversation moving forward. Ambassador, how does it look? What are the pressing challenges you see, particularly in Iraq or in the Middle East generally?
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I, too, have spoken to a number of World Affairs Councils around the country over the last 20 years or so. So I'm delighted to be here at the national conference. I think sovereignty, as you pointed out in the framing of your question, remains a sort of the basic unit of international law and international relations. And so it's the sovereign state that is sort of cognizable at the international level. And the entire system in which most of us have lived all our lives, any of us born after 1945, the entire system under which we live is predicated upon the sovereign state. That is to say, the international order, obviously, which, of course, was the principal creator of which was the United States in this very town, both the economic and the political post-war system. And I would add the greatest beneficiary of that system has also been the United States. But that's a topic for a whole other day, I suppose. So the system is designed with the notion that it is sovereign states that are at its core, and that it is sovereign states that cause problems. That is to say, conflicts are assumed to be between states. But that has not actually been the experience since 1945. I remember when I first arrived at the UN, shortly after I arrived at the UN representing Iraq, the Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, had commissioned a report on shared responsibilities and collective responses to shared threats. One point of which I think was to criticize the war that had brought about the demise of the previous regime in Iraq. But there was a graph in that report. Now, granted, this is 20 years ago now, so I don't know what the current numbers are, but as of that time, it graphed the number of international armed conflicts in the world from 1945 to whenever the last data were available, I think 2002, and the number of non-international armed conflicts. The number of international armed conflicts was fairly stable and quite low, say below 5 a year. And there's actually a point over that period of time, and I no longer remember what year it was, when the number of international armed conflicts went to 0. The real problem that confronts the international community are non-international armed conflicts. And those hover at a relatively much higher number, and the year that it was 0 for international armed conflicts, it actually reached a maximum in the graph, at least, of the number of civil wars, non-international armed conflicts. I'm not saying there's a correlation between the two, much less causation, and neither did the report. It just coincidentally worked out that way. And so the basic problem that confronts the world is not what the system is designed to deal with. And so if you want me to focus on the part of my world I spend most of my day thinking about, for the last year, there has been a war in Gaza between, mostly between Hamas, a non-state actor, mostly, although sort of also a state actor, and Israel, a state actor. There is more latterly a war between Israel and Hezbollah, which has one foot in the Lebanese state and one foot outside the Lebanese state. When I was in the United Nations in 2006, there was actually a war between Israel and Hezbollah in which, like today, the Lebanese government was a bystander. And so and you can replicate that across the Middle East. You can replicate that, I think, in other parts of the world, perhaps in Africa and other places. But in any event, this is, I think, one of the real stresses on the system is that the system is not, in fact, designed to deal with the actual threats of violence and the sort of, to use the jargon of the Charter, the threats to international peace and security. But there are, as you suggested in your question, other limitations on sovereignty that have arisen, some of which would probably surprise the drafters of the UN Charter, and that is, I don't know, a little over an hour ago now, a couple of hours ago, I saw the report that the ICC has issued an arrest warrant in any event, the sitting Prime Minister of Israel and the former defense minister. And so there are, where all that's going to go, it is easily predictable that the United States will do what it can to bring about the demise of the ICC, particularly the incoming administration, I think, which has already gone to, the former president, the president-elect, has already gone to war once with the ICC. And so all of that now is in the mix. Where we're headed is an interesting question. I'm not sure anyone really knows, but there are, I think, all of these sort of stresses in the system now that could not have been anticipated, and it's going to be very difficult to sort of sort through all that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want us to come back to this question, particularly at the end, and the role the United States can or should be playing in this. But what's clear, both from Chris's comments and from your comments, is we have created a system, and yet it does not necessarily match in the borders, in the consensus that exists within the borders, in the actual stressors, in the non-state actors that don't really care about the borders themselves and where they find affinity, positive non-state actors and malicious non-state actors. So we basically have a system that we've all agreed to and yet are somewhat turning a blind eye toward what are the shortcomings or the fallacies in the system that we just hoped would work out over time. Keith, what does this look like in the region that you're most familiar with in Latin America? You've obviously worked extensively on Venezuela, which is a state in crisis now, Haiti also in a difficult place. But what does it look like? What are the challenges you're seeing, particularly in the Latin America, Central and Latin America region?
Sure, thanks. Well, let me just frame it, I think, by suggesting that there's kind of three main issues in Latin America when it comes to sovereignty in terms of countries controlling their territory. The first one is transnational crime. The second is local gangs, and the third is insurgency. They're all very internal issues, and frankly, they're issues that the United States, in these cases, could ignore, but they have this kind of global impact in the way that they play out. So the first one, the transnational crime issue, is one that we're all familiar with. It's mostly transit routes for drugs and now increasingly people. Affects countries like Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, Jamaica, Colombia, Brazil, and now increasingly Ecuador. It's a phenomena that really has come from the inability of states to keep up with very well-armed and well-equipped actors that just have tons of money. The states have not designed their security forces or had their justice systems equipped to do what needs to be done to control these kinds of threats. So you have transnational criminal organizations that are running amok, frankly, throughout much of the hemisphere. They control some territory, but they mostly want routes to run their product, be it people, be it drugs, be it critical minerals or whatever. So it's a little bit different kind of a threat. The one that really got interesting was the local gangs that in El Salvador and Haiti are the two most acute cases that literally just started taking over whole swaths of territory in urban areas. And they did that because what they were after was very different. What they were after was the ability in the case of El Salvador to extort and the ability in the case of Haiti to kidnap. To do that, they had to control territory. They didn't just want a route. They wanted the actual territory where they could actually control an entire neighborhood or an entire part of the city. Bukele, of course, responded to the threat in El Salvador with the state of exception, so he's gone to this extreme way of incarcerating 80,000 gang members or supposed gang members with no due process, no rule of law. Very interesting response to that. Haiti is in a very different case, of course, and the gangs have now taken over 85% of Port-au-Prince, and frankly, they're on the verge of taking over the entire city. So that's a whole nother problem set. In all of these cases, again, I think the lapse was sovereignty was effectively robbed from states who didn't have the judicial system, the security forces that they needed to keep up with these criminal gangs. And I think that was what it really sort of came down to. And then the third issue is really only in Colombia, but that's the places where there are political criminal groups, the ELN, the residual FARC, the other kinds of groups, the Gaitanistas now, that have some kind of a political sheen on them, but really are also involved in massive criminal undertakings. And that's a very specific one to Colombia. A little bit less about the security forces not being able to keep up than it was about the security forces getting where they need to be. And the Colombian case, if you remember when the FARC came in from the cold, the majority of the FARC, some split off and formed other dissident FARC groups, but when they came in from the cold, signed the peace process, there was a massive plan in place that was supposed to then extend the state out into the countryside, out into all of the country's territory, and particularly the places where the FARC had been. That really never happened. And so you've now got a Colombia where the urban areas are very different than they would have been 20 years ago. You've got a very, very compelling, dynamic, progressive state, again, mostly for the urban areas, and then the countryside, the Colombia adentro, is kind of left alone. So again, a challenge of resources, of institutions, and of the state getting where it needs to be.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I want to pick up on a theme which all three of you have talked about, which are non-state actors, right? When we talk about sovereign states, we're talking about a government that is governing a territory as the supposed sole power, but because of resources, because of capacity, because of many other things, we recognize that that is in many, many cases not the case. Chris, let me start with you. Based on your experience in Central and West Africa, can you speak to the threat that non-state actors play, particularly in ungoverned spaces, and there are quite a few ungoverned spaces. What does it mean for the government and the consequences for neighboring states when you have swaths of ungoverned territories or where there is a contestation between non-governmental and non-state actors and state actors?
Well, thanks, Nicole. Very fascinating question. And in fact, as I listened to the ambassador, I really was in agreement and thinking to myself that the international community is going to have to come up with a framework that avoids us playing a whack-a-mole. You know, we created a framework to deal with nation states. Now the trouble is emerging elsewhere at the corner. It's like trying to keep a balloon underwater. You know, you push it down and it pops up somewhere else. But I'm also reminded that it could also be that the international community is not set to deal with the state actors, not prepared to deal with the state actors that are themselves also undermining the concept of sovereignty. I mean, a few weeks ago, I was in Moldova, and in this young, emerging, forward-leaning, but small country, there's part of its territory that's being occupied by a big power that doesn't share a national border, a national boundary with Moldova. And that's going to make it extremely difficult in the Transnistria area for Moldova to be able to assert its sovereignty. If you look at what's happening in Eastern Congo, for example, and we've all seen reports about millions of people dying in Eastern Congo because of conflict, which in some ways is being prodded by state actors. But we collectively haven't had the courage to call the state actors to task and hold them responsible for their activities in spurring conflict and violent crimes in Eastern Congo. And so to come back to your question, you can see the devastating effect of non-state actors, especially in young emerging democracies. And you look at what is happening in the Sahel, for example. I remember that not too long ago, Mali, for example, was being cited as a fledgling democracy in Africa. In fact, Mali and South Africa were the two African representatives at the launching of the Community of Democracies in 2001, which is a community of democratic nations around the world. It was a source of pride. But because of what has happened in Mali, because of the impact of external forces in the Sahel, because of the intervention of the military in the political process, Mali is no longer able to assert its sovereignty, but at the same time, it's lost its democracy in that process. And unfortunately, if you look at the map of Africa and you go from the Atlantic Ocean, you know, Mauritania so far is stable, but once you go past Mauritania, you have Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger and Chad and Sudan, and you get into the Horn. And so there's a whole swath of the middle path of Africa in which central governments have lost their sovereignty and in which non-state actors are extremely active. That has a perverse effect on the allocation of resources, because invariably these governments are now going to be forced to invest all of the, a sizable chunk of their national budgets, of their GDPs into security and defense purposes. And so the whole realm of social sectors, education, health, employment for youth will be undermined. And that has a very perverse effect, because then you get into this chicken and egg issue, because the more unemployed youth you have, the more a segment of your population is attracted to those non-state actors who undermine the state at the same time. And I think also it makes it extremely difficult for all the investments that are going into development from international partners to be able to bring dividends. It makes it extremely difficult for the private sector internationally to be able to build partnerships or to be able to invest in those countries in a way that can make them attractive. And so if we don't wrestle this issue to the ground, I think we're going to wake up and find that there's such an imbalance in the global sense of stability and stability and good governance that would make the next century a little more complicated to manage than it is currently. Thank you.
Very well said. I think that spiral of governments not able to govern their territories and deliver for their citizens, which then undermines their legitimacy, which drives many people into non-state actors, is the cycle that we will be in for many years if we can't figure out how to break that. Ambassador al-Istrabadi, you were there in the room where it happened, where there was the writing of the Iraqi interim constitution. What were the thoughts or the considerations that were put into the drafting of that document to uphold the sovereignty of Iraq at such a crucial time?
Well, I have to say, and I was there because I was a legal advisor to my mentor, who was a member of the governing council presidency at the time, the former foreign minister of Iraq in the 1960s, Dr. Adnan Pachachi, who did his PhD here in 1948 at Georgetown University, I should say. There was nothing on which the Iraqi political class post-2003 agreed, except one thing, exactly one thing, and that was we needed to get rid of Paul Bremer. And that was...
You need to microphone. Look, no, just hold it closer to your face. Yeah.
There was exactly one thing. I usually don't have any difficulty making myself heard, and I assure you I could make myself heard in this room without a microphone. I was a trial lawyer before I was a diplomat. I can make myself heard. But anyway, the one thing the Iraqi political class agreed on, and only one thing, was that the American civil administrator in Iraq had to go, Paul Bremer. And that focused the minds of the Iraqi political class because we had no agreement. We all agreed Iraq should be turned into a federal state from a highly centralized state, which it had historically been since the end of the First World War. But none of us agreed on what the term federalism actually meant. And I think we still don't. Which is okay. I think 250 years on, I'm not sure the Americans have come to an agreement on what it means either. So that's okay. That's part of the politics. And it's better to do politicking than shooting at one another. But that was the imperative, is that Iraq needed to sort of gain its role, a natural role, not the outsized role that Saddam Hussein had tried to have Iraq play, but a natural role. Iraq, after all, is a founding member of the United Nations. It's a founding member of the Arab League. It's a founding member of the organization, what is now called the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and so on. And it had always had a certain role in regional affairs. By 2003, of course, it had been particularly anemic. The central government in Baghdad barely controlled sort of the middle part of the country, and point south, it had lost control of the Kurdish region of Iraq. And so there was a sense that we needed to reintroduce a sovereign Iraq on the world stage. And so that, I think, was the first and most important consideration. Then there was the question, of course, of the internal political system that we would create. And Iraq had in the monarchy a a history of having a prime ministerial system, of course, and so we returned to that, to a sort of a quasi-parliamentary system. But those are sort of domestic considerations. But the first goal was to seek to, and we coined the word, I think, reassert. It's in Resolution 1746, and I believe, I'll be happy to be shown to be wrong about this, but I think, because I was with the foreign minister when we were, as his legal advisor when we were negotiating Resolution 1546, sorry, in New York. I think we used the word reasserted its sovereignty for the first time in international law. A colleague of mine who would later become the first representative here in Washington, Mrs. Renda Rahim, insisted that it be an active verb, as opposed to somehow Iraq receiving its sovereignty back from the Security Council or the occupying forces. So whether she or somehow we came up with the word reassert. And so that was a source of sort of real pride for us, that the notion that Iraq would be sitting around the table again in an organization that it had helped to found, after all. And I remember I was sitting around the horseshoe when the vote was taken, the unanimous vote was taken on Resolution 1746, and I went out, I keep saying 17, it's 1546. And I went out into the scrum where the reporters are, and I said just that this is Iraq's opportunity to gain its natural place in the community of nations. So that was really important. The problem, of course, was that Iraq was still a very weak state on the brink of failing. And so there was not an ability to assert itself domestically in the ways that my colleagues have been talking about. That is a process that has taken 20 years. Iraq as a state is much stronger than it was 20 years ago. And ironically and unfortunately, one of the reasons for that is exactly because of the rise of a non-state actor, ISIL, which sought to destroy the sovereignty of two states and to destroy an internationally recognized border. And it was in response to that stimulus, I think, that Iraq really managed to regain itself to the extent that it has, and it still has a way to go.
Indeed, indeed. I think it's a great segue to a question for Keith, which is, we see a lot of countries which are on the brink of failure or are failed states. And I would love to hear your thought and your experiences of how do we, what are the challenges of institution building, of trying to turn that failure around and build an infrastructure that allows a state to actually reclaim or reassert its sovereignty?
Sure, and I think Haiti is probably the test case right now. It's a real test case for the international community. Is there a way to help this beleaguered state to reset? I mean, there's a couple things I think with regard to Haiti that you have to remember. Whenever you mention Haiti, and my own personal service there was in the 90s. I was there from 95 to 97 during the transition from Aristide to Preval and the kind of the heyday of the institution building that the United States and others were involved in there. And but when you mention Haiti today, you get an eye roll, and then you get this sense, well, everything's been tried, nothing worked, so there's nothing else to be done. It really ignores the periods in Haiti when things were progressing, and there have been a number of them. That early period after the first intervention was a period of tremendous progress, and then the lead up to the earthquake, the period before the earthquake was another one where there really was progress. You could mark it, you could count it, you could see it. Everything was getting better. But it was a state that was coming out of such a horrific experience with the Duvaliers that they had just crushed the entire country. And I think we just didn't come in acknowledging the length of time it was going to take to get Haiti back on its feet. Then you say, well, we've been at this for a long time and nothing really worked. But the ups and downs of our involvement in Haiti are they're just marked. I mean, they are just tremendous. The last one was the worst, and that was 2017 when there was a pretty robust UN mission there. The UN comes with all sorts of baggage in Haiti, I get that. But it also comes with all of the different things you need to help a country reset. And I have to just be a champion for the UN. My book, which is for sale in the back there somewhere, it recounts a lot of the cases that I was involved in where the UN just was simply the only organization that could do the work that needed to be done. And I think we need to grow up a little bit, frankly, as a country and get over this aversion to the UN and just see it as the institution that brings everything that's needed in a real case of extreme fragility like Haiti. So I would say that going forward, looking at the UN in a kind of a new light. But in 2017, when we pulled back funding from peacekeeping globally and basically pulled back the UN from Haiti, that was where the current unraveling started. So what had been a fragile state, again, is now very close to being a failed state. Without the UN, you didn't have the political guardrails, you didn't have the mentoring and the help for the security forces. Next thing you know, you have the assassination of a president and then a total vacuum where gangs were able to fill in behind what would have been the government. So I would say the UN, I mean, there's a lot of ideas now. There's even one of a trusteeship, but I think the more likely one would be probably something with a restored UN mission at the level that's needed. The US is going to have to lead from the front, not behind, the way we're trying to do now. And there's really, the security forces of Haiti are really the key element. There would have to be a massive kind of a train and equip program that would give them the means they need to take back the streets and to restore sovereignty over the country, and starting, of course, even with the capital. How are we doing on time? We're kind of short, right?
I'd like to turn to the audience pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
if you want to wrap up, and I'll give
So
the ambassador one
real
very
quick,
brief one.
real quick on Venezuela. Venezuela is another case where sovereignty is an interesting concept. And I mean, as I read sovereignty, you've got as we talked about, the period where sovereignty was just nations supposedly leaving each other alone internally. Then the Cold War comes along and you kind of have a hyper-Westphalian system where every piece of territory is controlled by somebody because there was an angle to it. Then you have the post-Cold War era where you've got the humanitarian interventions where we endeavored to jump into another nation to try to help with something where there was mass killings or famine. Somalia, again, being kind of the classic case of that. I'm really glossing over this. But then you had the post-9/11 period of regime changes, very checkered record there. Venezuela is an interesting case now because you've got a country that has just created such a horrible system, horrible economic and political system, that about a quarter of the country has now left the country. So they've effectively chased out a quarter of their own citizens. But there's no real tools to bring them to bear against Venezuela that would cause them to return to democracy, to return to a system that actually functions. So we're in this kind of gray area, and it's actually, to me, a kind of a negative place. It's what Brzezinski talked about when he said a lot of times we get just enough involved to be responsible for something without being involved enough to actually make it work. The go-to thing for us now is sanctions. So in an environment where we're not going to intervene militarily or even hint at military intervention, and we're pretty decided about that, I think, right now, we basically use sanctions. And I think it's a tool that really needs a better look, because it's so devastating to a country's economy, but doesn't really have the means to do what we're trying to do. So I think in Venezuela, we're kind of in this gray area where we're trying to figure out how we can move them in a new direction. We have to breach their sovereignty to do that, but we don't quite have the will to do it all the way to the end. So we've kind of left them in a limbo, and it's a very negative place for them to be.
Thank you for that. I am going to go to audience questions. I see 1, 2 over there, and we will take them. And Ambassador, if you can roll your thoughts in there, grab my microphone.
And I'm sorry, I did something that I should have done earlier, which was we'd like to have our first question for the student scholars that are here, and then asking, please, everyone who asks a question, please be short and concise on your question. Sorry,
Excellent.
I should have said that.
Excellent. Why don't we take several questions? And I don't know who our student scholars are. I'm going to make some guesses. Are you one? Are you nodding? Or you? Okay. We'll give it to the gentleman there who is a student scholar, and then the woman who's had her hand up. So if we could get him microphone. Can we do that and then come back over here? He said he's a student scholar, so I'm following the rules. Got it. We'll take those 2 questions together, and then I'll take one over here, I promise. And very brief name, and then your question, and then we'll pass it to the next person, please.
My name is Marwan. I'm originally from Morocco, and I'm representing Global Minnesota here. My question is about the Sahel and the recent geopolitical developments there. I want to know how the Alliance of Sahel States stand a chance in reinforcing the sovereignty of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger by reinforcing regional sovereignty, given its competition also with another regional organization that is ECOWAS. Thank you.
Great question, great question. All right, we'll take a second question here, specifically about how the role of regional organizations in reinforcing sovereignty. Yes, please.
Gomri Rastampur from Maine. My question is for Mr. Ambassador. And with all the mass killing and genocide and chemical bomb that is happened to Kurdish people, isn't it a time for Kurdish people to have their own state and practice their government? Thank you so much.
Excellent. Okay, two very great questions. Why don't we take a third and then we'll answer all of them together. Our friend with the microphone is going to get his steps in this morning. All right. You can pick one of the people over there. We'll take those three questions. So a question also about the Kurdish north in Iraq and the question of sovereignty, which has been one that's been debated many years. All right, one question here, and then we'll go down our panel.
Hi, my name is Braden Potter. I'm from the Worcester World Affairs Council, and I have a question for the former ambassador. My question is in regards to in the UN with dialogue relating to non-state actors versus state actors. Has that dialogue shifted with recent interstate conflict recently back towards interstate conflict? And has, oh, you can't hear me?
Can I summarize your question for you if I understand it? The question is really the role of non-state actors in diplomatic negotiations as we're looking at some of these complex situations, did I get that? Excellent. Okay, so because I just want to give, I hope I didn't cut that off. That was, yep, okay. So good questions. ECOWAS, which is a regional organization in West Africa, what's the role of that in reinforcing sovereignty or creating a super sovereignty? Question about the Iraqi territory, the Iraqi north in Iraq, and then the question of non-state actors, and Keith, if you want to jump in somewhere in any of those, non-state actors in diplomacy, because diplomacy ultimately is the conversation between two sovereign states. So I'll turn to you, Chris, and then Ambassador.
Sure. Thank you very much for the excellent question from my brother from Morocco. The Association of Sahelian States, it's an interesting development. I personally do have some reservations for two reasons. One is the manner in which these three countries, that's Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, that want to form this new union, the manner in which they've come out of another regional organization, which was also working towards regional sovereignty. And so, how do you guarantee that their new commitment to the AES is going to be long-lasting if, you know, in the flip of a coin, they could undermine the efforts to build a strong regional organization in ECOWAS for the past 50 years. And so the good lawyers around us may think about character witnesses. Would you bet on them to be more faithful to EAS and to stay along and to do the hard work that it takes to keep that association working or not? Secondly, when you look at the map of Africa and you look at the regional and sub-regional organizations, there's a lot of overlap. And it doesn't necessarily have to be hostility amongst organizations. There's COMESA, there's IGAD, there's SADC, there's all kinds of associations that are formed amongst nation states that are complementary or that seek to be complementary. And so I worry about an organization that emerges with one of its prime missions being overt hostility to the organization to which they've belonged for the past 50 years. And then the last thing I would say, going back to the role of external actors, and I think it's really critical for the case of Africa, that even as we lament what is being done by external non-state actors, it's happening before our own eyes, that it's a new phenomenon of non-state actors sponsored by powerful states that are sending mercenaries into African countries. And so what does it mean when these mercenaries come in and capture the state at the level of the president's office. And so you go to the Central African Republic, the presidency is being guarded by Russian mercenaries. It's the same in Bamako. It's the same in Burkina Faso. It's the same now in Sudan. And so how can you, in that context, still talk about the sovereignty of those Sahelian states when they themselves are already captive to non-state foreign actors at the same time as they're talking about sovereignty? So I think there's a lot of conversations to be had there, but I don't think the AAS is the unique solution. If they thrive and survive, that could be another addition, but they don't have to dislocate ECOWAS, which so far has made quite tremendous progress for West Africa. Thank you.
That was an extraordinary answer, Chris, and it touched upon so many issues. We could be here probably until Monday afternoon unpacking those. But this question also of how do we deal with sovereign states that are using non-state actors to undermine the sovereignty of other states. The responsibility of a sovereign state to follow international laws is its own thing that we could unpack, but then the role of non-state actors. So thank you for at least putting all those seeds of conversation out. Ambassador, 2 questions for you, and then we will wrap up.
First, I do want to say one thing that my colleague said about the United Nations, and that is, when the United States found itself going into Iraq with generally against the will of the aggregate of the international community, although there were something like 39 or 40 coalition of the willing states that went along. But when it got to Iraq and it needed to start to get things done, it couldn't do it on its own. And it had to go to the United Nations. And before Resolution 1546, there was Resolution 1348, which created a United Nations mission in Iraq, which was in aid of, its principal aim of which was in supporting the political and economic development of Iraq. And then in 1546, to get an internationally recognized sovereign government, the United States had to go back to the United Nations to get another unanimous resolution from the Security Council recognizing that indeed the transitional government and then the interim government of Iraq were in fact sovereign. The United States is more powerful than any other state, but it is not more powerful than all states put together. And it does need the international community. I couldn't agree with you more than when you said that the UN is really an important institution that the United States benefits from. As far as the Kurds, you've asked me a political question, not a legal one. If you're asking me, are the Kurds going to get an independent state anywhere in the Middle East in my lifetime? The answer to that is, I think no. Not because they shouldn't have one or don't deserve one, but because the politics don't line up. They are a landlocked peoples. They are distributed amongst 4 sovereign states, barring some real collapse in Turkey. Even Syria, which has been teetering on collapse since 2012 or 11, is not soon going to lose the Kurdish provinces. Or in Iraq, which is stronger now than it was 20 years ago, and I will predict will be stronger 10 years from now than it is now as a state. And similarly in Iran, it's simply not in the cards. Now you say genocide. Now I agree with you, there was a genocide of the Kurds, but it's 40 years ago. The international community is not going to intervene in aid of Kurdish independence because they were subject to a genocide 40 years ago. Maybe they should be, but they're not going to do it. If the international community did not intervene when the Anfal campaign was going on in 1987 and 1988 when Halabja was gassed, it's not going to intervene 40 years later. That's a fact. Now, again, that's not me advocating for this or that result. That simply is the way international politics work. You asked me a political question, I've given you a political answer.
I'm getting the lurking John over my shoulder, and sorry to interrupt, but I want us to keep on schedule. Can I turn it?
Yes, you
Okay.
can.
Can you just, real quick for the gentleman's question about non-state actors and diplomacy, and then just 30 seconds, and we'll pass it to John.
I think I can do it in 30 seconds. From the perspective of an organization like the United Nations, non-state actors get a kind of seat at the table when they are able to disrupt the state sufficiently through, principally, almost always through violence. I can't think of an example when it isn't through violence. Until they get to that point of destabilizing the state, they generally don't have a seat at the table, certainly at the United Nations. And even at the United Nations, they don't have a seat at the table. What they end up with is maybe some meetings with some representative of the Secretary General, but they have to have reached a critical mass of being disruptive to the state in order to get that kind of minimal recognition in terms of actual status at places like the United Nations. The way the system is set up right now, you have to be an actual state to have a seat at the table. That's the black letter law answer.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's an important thing that you have a seat at the table. You have to be a sovereign state, and yet we have just heard an hour of the challenges of being a sovereign state and actually functioning. And so it gives us a great deal to think about, to unpack, and to continue to work on in this area. John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Nicole, and please join me in a round of applause to Nicole and our panelists.